We're all thinking it anyway. Penn State did lose Jaylen Matthews because of NIL.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, that is right. You are Locked On Nittany Lions. Thanks so much for making us your first listen and watch every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And we bring them back given the news surrounding Jaylen Matthews and then Penn State losing out on some other commits. Brian Smith coming back from the Locked On Podcast Network as he is the Locked On recruiting analyst. So the perfect expert to discuss some of the things. The tide is not going into Penn State's favor, to say the least. Brian, we're going to start with Jaylen Matthews here and then talk about some other. Jaylen Harvey has been on the radar forever. Nigel Smith is finally off the radar, just to name a couple here. But Jaylen Matthews, the face of the class of 2025, frankly. Okay. 4-star, 5-star offensive tackle, arguably could be the best in the class of 2025 when all said and done as far as the recruiting rankings go. And he finally puts out, now this, I felt like the writing was on the wall all to begin with. He was taking so many other visits. He was posting saying, hey, I got offered by this school. I was offered by them. I've been here. I'm visiting here. And it's just like, man, you committed to Penn State. And then other verbal commits that have committed early to Penn State just haven't boasted as much about seeing other schools. So I'm not saying like, oh, he's cheating on Penn State. That's not what I'm saying here. But in the past, before all those other visits took place, they backed out of their commitment to Penn State or to other schools. So it was always there. The evidence was there. But Brian, just with Georgia and Texas getting into the fold, it's hard for me to not sit back and speculate that NIL is the factor in this case for Penn State not being able to retain Jaylen Matthews here.
That wouldn't be very surprising. Those are two schools that are known to be involved with that. He is a 2025 kid. Those are two hot programs. There's a lot of reasons, but NIL would be my first pick as well. I don't know the kid or the circumstance, but you're probably onto something there.
I mean, especially now I've heard that I'm dead wrong. I'm not. It's the name of the game. Okay. Name, image, and likeness. Schools are going to be willing to cut checks to get you to go and play for their football program. And it's not like, forget Georgia and Texas aside, we've seen it with, hey, Texas A&M is willing to do it. Oh. Florida is willing to do it. So why aren't schools like Georgia and Texas, who seem to have Jaylen Matthews the most interest here? And I don't blame these guys. I don't blame these kids for wanting to follow the money if it's on the table. If the opportunity is there when you are a high school kid and you haven't played a down of college football, you haven't even sniffed getting close to professional football, and someone's going to offer you, we're not talking about, well, it's about $1,000 to $2,000, maybe up to $10,000. No, this is life-changing money. Brian, if you offered me $100,000 plus, up to, we know that some recruits have even received up to $1 million to go play before they even set foot on a college football field. That's the crazy part to me. It's not after they do it, it's before they do it. So when that money's on the table for any player at the high school level, it makes total sense here. But Jaylen Matthews, you can't tell me and sit back and say, well, he didn't like Penn State. Penn State was always one of his first visits, even though he was seeing and going to other schools. He committed very early. James Franklin harps when he's talking about recruiting, when he says, if you want to go here, you commit. So don't tell me that said, well, Jaylen Matthews lost interest, or there are some other schools that were more involved with his recruitment that Penn State didn't try. That is not the case. Jaylen Matthews liked Penn State, but I just think there were some higher monetary offers from other institutions.
That's just the way of the world that we're in here. And the NCAA is toothless. They don't want to cut their own checks and cut them in half. So
no,
it's just, there's really not much you can do. So unless you want to make this a public squabble. Mm-hmm. And at some point, somebody's going to do it more. There's a certain guy right down the road from Penn State at Pittsburgh that's done that in a certain situation about a year ago. But outside of him, there really hasn't been that many, because most schools, quite frankly, cheat. in some capacity. So it's just true. And it's like blatantly, they deny it, but I'm in the recruiting industry. It's a joke behind the scenes with all the recruiting analysts. But the NIL thing and the upfront money is the new kid on the block. And because there's so many people involved, some not directly with the school, but could impact the school, I think a lot of coaches and administrators are afraid to turn anybody in because they're afraid somebody else turn around and say, well, you had a booster that did this or that. And then it's just, you can't win. So if Penn State wants to get him, they're going to have to try another means. I don't know what it is, but he is a really good player.
And Penn State, if it comes to upfront money, okay, Penn State, and some fans might agree with this, some fans might not, okay, from Penn State's perspective. The upfront money is taboo for some people, whereas you go to the SEC, you go to the Big 12, schools going from the Big 12 to the SEC, right? There are schools that are not afraid to pay upfront money, but the whole idea with Penn State, success with honor, you got to earn your NIL. Penn State's here to back you once you sign, once you commit, once you are physically on campus. They are willing to help you out and be your biggest supporter when it comes to NIL. But it seems like this is the case for not only Penn State, Notre Dame, Ohio State. Basically, the Big Ten and the SEC are doing two different things when it comes to NIL. The Big Ten schools are promising it and are there day one when you step on campus. But for the SEC and some other Southern schools, it is, we'll give you money day one when you step foot on here for a visit and when you sign. That's the difference here. So that is why Penn State lost out on Jaylen Matthews.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised by that. But just to add to it, there are a lot of kids that are getting money just to take visits.
Yeah.
So, look, that's the world we're in. I'm so used to it living in the state of Florida, which is ground zero for anything nefarious in recruiting, that I mean, I have more stories than you could possibly imagine. But the point is still the same. Unless you're going to turn somebody in, it's not going to change. So, and even then, it probably wouldn't a lot because people just don't care how they win. It's just the society that we're in, and that's the end of it. So, and this kid, look at it this way, if Texas is recruiting a kid from New Jersey, he's not good. He's exceptional.
Yeah.
I mean, Texas doesn't have to recruit outside its state borders very often. So what's that tell you about the Matthews kid?
I mean, I wouldn't sit back here and say that he's a left tackle. A left tackle it's not a quarterback. It's not a running back. It's not a wide receiver, right? We all know about the skilled position players. Okay. Those are typically going to be the face, or a stud linebacker or cornerback, somebody that is a real game changer. That I can sit here in this chair and say that Jaylen Matthews is the face of your class of 2025. He is special. He's a very good player. I think he's a generational talent. And he committed early. He was already like this as a sophomore, and going into his senior year, I think he will be the number one tackle when the recruiting rankings are finalized. So this is a big loss for Penn State. Okay. It's not something that Penn State can't recover from, but it kind of reminds me of the Justin Fields situation where that top recruit ends up spurning Penn State. They go away from Penn State. And they choose somewhere else. And it's like, as Penn State as an institution, its fans believe that this should not happen here. But recovering is, you're just going to have to go get that next 4-star tackle or that next group of offensive line. I get it. Right now, the offensive line room is very crowded. People have brought up to me that when you look at Georgia, when you look at Texas, Penn State has 12 offensive linemen by the time that Jaylen Matthews is going to be enrolled and hypothetically playing for the Nittany Lions. And he still could come back around if Penn State wants to change its NIL approach. But I really do think he's going to commit to a Georgia or a Texas. That's why I constantly keep bringing them up. He seems to be the most interested in those two schools. I think Rutgers, being the home school, does have a slight chance, depending on what they're able to do to keep him home. But for Penn State, they're just going to have to look down the rankings and say, okay, who is our next target? Because we missed out on our primary one.
It's part of the process, man. I would look at it as a coach like, well, who's next? That's the only option you have. It's not like you're not going to fill the scholarship. You lose recruits all the time. You just go to the next guy and you still recruit your top guy. That's literally how it works. So, I mean, I know fans don't like this kind of stuff, but the same thing I told you before the show, I'm going to say now. This is part of the process. Fans need to get over. A lot of people bitch because they look at the star rankings. Don't do that. Do the film evaluation yourself. And then, just watch the next kid and trust in the Penn State staff. They've got the program to this far. So these are your guys. You're going to ride with them. Let's see what they do now.
I mean, the good news is you look at and I have them pulled up. You look at the class of 2025 offensive line rankings individually, the tackle rankings, and a lot of guys are still undecided. Okay. Jaylen Matthews was just the exception of the fact that he committed very early, but Penn State, if they do want to reconsider their options at offensive tackle and still feel like they need a high profile type of player, because I think they're really good, but you got to continue and keep building for the future. Are there any names, Brian, for you that come to mind, or it's just the class is completely wide open? Penn State could land anybody that's in essentially the top 20, the top 50 of these rankings at offensive tackle here. Is there a name that they should try to target to replace Jaylen Matthews in this instance?
I don't know if you're going to replace him because he might be the best tackle in the country, but there's another kid from New Jersey that's good, and Jaden Elijah. I mean, there's a lot of kids like that. There's a really good kid from New York. There's a couple of good kids from Maryland, and there's always going to be somebody from Pennsylvania. And that's just your starter home base. And this coaching staff has done a better job of recruiting Texas, Florida, Georgia than any staff prior in Happy Valley. So I would say they're going to be fine. The offensive line coach is the rare exception because he actually engages in recruiting. Most O-line coaches hate it. It's not their personality to like recruiting, especially in today's era. So I'm not real worried about it for Penn State. For Penn State, it's always the same. It's the same deal with all the northern schools. Can they get corners and DNs? If they get those two spots, they'll get the linemen and the offensive players. And they need corners and DNs. If you're getting those, you'll be fine.
And Penn State has done a good job to this point in the current, in class of 2024. Let's think about Liam Andrews. I'm just giving an example, right? You named a couple of players. I'm going to name one back for you. Hardy Watts is a teammate of Liam Andrews. Liam Andrews is committed to Penn State as a defensive lineman. Hardy Watts is listed as a top 20 offensive tackle at the same high school. So Penn State, if they want to, I just want to give people options to say, oh, wait, well, what's Penn State doing now? What is Penn State doing now to answer that question? There are plenty of options. And Michael Carroll, who's a legacy, is currently listed as an offensive tackle, according to Rivals also. So I know that he projects a little more as a guard, but don't think that offensive line is completely becoming an afterthought for the class of 2025. They just now have to make some changes. Brian, we still have plenty to discuss as far as specific players go. Jaylen Harvey's one of them. It seems like USC has made a come-from-behind effort to challenge Penn State on recruiting. Maryland is not out of it. He's a Maryland native. We're going to discuss that in the next segment and still look at the outlook for the class. That's why I wanted to save that for the 2024 and 2025 outlook for Penn State. But before we discuss that, let's hear from one of our sponsors of today's episode, and that is eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. It's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level up to its peak performance, from supercharges, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million, that is 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Motors Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebay.com/motors. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible only. Items only apply. Exclusions apply. And Locked On Nittany Lions is your go-to podcast for HappyValleyInsider.com. Check them out. Penn State Rivals, of course. They were one of the first ones to kind of really get in on the scoop of Jaylen Matthews and the possibility of decommitting from Penn State very soon. And when it comes to the recruiting scoops, they are typically out in front when it comes to the Nittany Lions and what they're doing for the class rankings, the players, verbal commitments, decommitments, you name it, HappyValleyInsider.com. decommitted.com. And Brian Smith, the recruiting expert. That's why we bring him back for these kinds of news bits. And then one that's on the horizon. About a month ago, you and I discussed it just a few weeks back, and we are anticipating that Jaylen Harvey is going to make a decision soon at the end of September, most likely. That is at least what the sources at happyvalleyinsider.com say, is that a commitment is coming from Jaylen Harvey. Jaylen Harvey's situation gets very interesting because he took that first visit out to USC. Now, I know USC had a week 0 game, so that kind of makes sense. They played San Jose State. Penn State, Maryland did not have a game, but his first visit was out to USC. And originally, at that point in time, he didn't have any visits set up for Penn State or Maryland. Now he does. He's actually going to see the Maryland-Virginia game that is coming up. And then this is the place to do it. Brian, you and I have discussed this. You have to go to the whiteout. And that's the one that Jaylen Harvey, I feel like that's when he's going to actually make his decision, is after that time, because happyvalleyinsider.com brought this up, right? That they anticipated a commitment from him at the end of September, as late as early October, and Jaylen Harvey going to the whiteout game against Iowa on September 23rd. So now you've kind of taken your final visit. You've gone to USC. You'll be at the Maryland game, a Friday night game between Maryland and Virginia, and then you go to the whiteout. I can't imagine that he's going to take more visits after that, but I feel like that's going to be it for him. Like, you are going to know at that point, but still, it just doesn't. He's taken so long to make this decision. I hope that the whiteout is enough to confirm what he's really known all along and what the recruiting experts have feel. The recruiting experts, maybe, and Brian, maybe you've changed your opinion, but it seems like whether it's Rivals or 24/7 or On3, that the recruiting experts still believe and have not changed their pick as far as where Jaylen Harvey is going to go, and it's still Penn State.
My guess is that it's not Penn State because it's taken too long. It was too easy. And it's not necessarily him either. There's something that's off.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Like anything else, all parties have to be in agreement. Something tells me there's something off in that regard. And possibly it's a scenario where somebody in his family, maybe his head coach, wants him to look elsewhere. I have no idea. I don't know the kid. But when a kid visits a school and you know that he likes that school very early on in the like you as an underclassman, Penn State was involved with him. Well, why hasn't he committed? Franklin and those guys don't fail in recruiting. That's the one thing I know. They do a very good job. So if you want to yell at them for something else, that's fine, but it sure as heck isn't recruiting. So I'm guessing there's something else going on there.
It would seem to be, I mean, Maryland's the hometown school. USC just kind of comes in last moment, and you got to imagine, is NIL involved here? What's the case? But we know for a fact that Jaylen Harvey really likes Penn State with the amount of times that he's visited. These projections for him to commit to Penn State, as you said, were put out a long time ago. It's not like this was in the last month or two. This has been for the last year. Okay, so we know that Jaylen Harvey more or less wants to be a Nittany Lion, but if USC and Maryland's recruiting pitch just happens to be a little better than Penn State's because of the nature of the game with NIL, then that's going to be a different story. And again, I don't blame these kids, these young men, for making a financial decision. I really don't, especially when hundreds of I'm not saying that's Jaylen Harvey specifically, okay? But we know that some of the top recruits are getting $100,000+ thousands of dollars to go to any of these schools.
Yeah, if that's what it is, then so be it. Again, it's just like the Jaylen Matthews deal. If that's what it is, you go to the next guy. I mean, there's no discussion. If Penn State's not willing to pay upfront money, and we know that's the deal here, then it's just next guy. There is no discussion point. So that's it.
So you say next guy, okay? In the class of 2024, ideally, you would think that next guy was going to be a Nigel Smith, but no, Nigel Smith's off the board. He decided to commit to Oklahoma, and I'm not really surprised about that in the slightest. It felt like, since he's a Midwest kid, so it really was going to come down to Oklahoma or Texas, and the Sooners are going to get Nigel Smith, but he did like Penn State. Penn State was in his top 5, to be honest.
That was not a shock to me because he lives just outside of Dallas, and Oklahoma has recruited that area forever and done very well. My only question now is, did Penn State go all in on this, or did they really have several kids they were interested in prior to this high school football season starting.
Mhm.
So they would have, a couple backup plans, or they're going to kind of play it by ear. Every school does it differently. And while Franklin and his staff have obviously recruited very well, again, what did I say a little bit ago? The only thing I worry about with Midwest schools are DNs and corners. If you miss at those spots, you're not going to the playoff and doing diddly, especially against what like Georgia is recruiting on the O-line. I mean, they are the elephant in the room, no pun intended, with Alabama, but Georgia's by far the best program in the country right now. It's not even close. So everybody's recruiting against them. You got to get D linemen to compete against them, Penn State included.
Yeah. And Penn State, I mean, they've done a good enough job. Okay. We've seen improvement under Deion Barnes. They got a lot of defensive tackles, but not enough edge rushers. Malachi Williams is the only true edge rusher. So they need a Jaylen Harvey. They needed a Nigel Smith if you were going to have to go that route. I think the other viable option that's still out there, but it's not looking good for Penn State, they're in his top three. And some college football recruiting experts, I think you know who I'm referring to here, Brian, but people listening or watching to this back are saying it's Brian Robinson, and they're not in a good position. It feels like 1A and 1B, it is Kentucky and Michigan, and then Penn State is a distant third. But if you are going to miss out on all three, I'm going to be really concerned, frankly, if you miss out on not only Jaylen Harvey, but Nigel Smith and Brian Robinson. Something's not right here.
Well, that just means sometimes you lose, but at the same time, you also got to have a backup plan. I don't know if there's a JUCO kid or transfer portal or whatever, but DN and corner, those two spots are just absolutely spots you cannot miss on. So they got to figure out something. There could be a late bloomer too. Every school does it, from Southern Cal, Notre Dame, Penn State to Miami. There's a kid every now and then you take a flyer on because he has the right measurables. There's still a long way to go until December 20th when National Signing Day gets here. So let's see kind of how they rebound.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, defensive line, Jaylen Harvey, it could end up anywhere. I don't know that it's specifically USC. It might be Maryland. It still could be Penn State. I like that. At least the way that it shapes up is that he took the USC visit early. That was in August, and that might be a distant memory. Okay, then he's going to go to Maryland on a Friday night game against Virginia. But you are going to the whiteout as your last hypothetical official visit. I'm not saying he can't take any more. He can take them all the way up until December. He could even go past that. That's just the early signing period for December. But it feels good that Penn State kind of gets that last word in for Harvey's recruitment. And I hope that maybe they can get both, right? And Penn State could have an embarrassment of riches if they're able to land not only Jaylen Harvey, but get Brian Robinson. I feel like that really rounds out the class of 2024. But you're right. There could be a late bloomer that we're just not aware of, that we don't know about. That's right. A senior having an incredible season. And then someone who signs very last second, like is on the radar of Penn State, like a Chimney Ono, someone who was a late bloomer on the offensive line, was committed to the likes of Old Dominion, became a 4-star prospect, and then ultimately flipped to Penn State. That could happen, and it doesn't even have to be at the early signing period in December. That could happen in January, February.
That is recruiting in 2023 personified.
It is Locked On Nittany Lions, and I want to encourage people to check out Locked On College Football Kickoff Live every Friday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And that is a live college football show to talk about everything college football related, the way that only Locked On hosts can do. I'm going to be a special guest on this Friday show, but check it out every college football, every college channel in the Locked On Podcast Network is going to be having it live, so you can't miss it, even right here on Locked On Nittany Lions. That is Locked On College Football Kickoff Live every Friday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Brian, before we move forward and just kind of get the overall outlook, if Penn State's going to miss out on edge rushers, if Penn State's going to lose the face of its class of 2025, how do they truly look for the future of recruiting? Before we get to that, let's hear from another sponsor of today's episode, and that is Jase Medical. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. And that's why Jase Medical offers the Jase Case. The Jase Case provides 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use and gives you peace of mind so that you are not just hoping that you have access to medication in an emergency, you actually have it. Jase Medical makes sure that you have that medication in hand. Jase Medical is simple. They handle everything from the online evaluation to licensed pharmacy medication delivery and ongoing consultation and care. Don't get caught unprepared. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using promo code Locked On at checkout at jacemedical.com. That is promo code Locked On at jacemedical.com for $20 off. That's JASEmedical.com, promo code Locked On. Brian, let us finish it up here on the show talking about the overall big picture for Penn State in the class of 2024 and the class of 2025. Depending on where you look, Penn State is on the outside looking in for the top 10. They're solidified in the top 15, and that's been a conversation we've had on this show. Where does Penn State ultimately project for the class of 2024? And I do want to bring this up as well because they can bolster this class with the likes of, but it's still speculation. Brian Robinson doesn't look good, but it could happen. There's a fighting chance. Jaylen Harvey does not look good, but there's a fighting chance. They could ultimately land both of them. There's a chance with, I'm not here to comment on Michigan State's situation. And I understand the severity of the situation. You lose your coach in the middle of the season, and it's just not a good look for Michigan State and the Spartans. I'm not here to comment on the logistics of it, the outcome. Everybody knows that it's wrong, and I don't need to sit back here and be an ethics professor on why Michigan State made the decision that it did, and it was the right one. But you think about what that means for recruiting battles that they had mutually. Nick Marsh was down to Michigan State and Penn State essentially, and he chose Michigan State. I hate to bring this up as a conversation, but it needs to be had, Brian. Does Penn State benefit for the class of 2024 by potentially getting a Nick Marsh because he liked Mel Tucker? Okay, yes, Michigan State is the home school, but he wanted to play for Mel Tucker. Mel Tucker's no longer with the Spartans. So does Penn State now have a fighting chance to add another high-profile wide receiver?
You know, there's been communication with Marsh from Penn State and probably 20 other schools.
Kansas.
But again,
yeah.
Oh, sure. I mean, at the same time, he's a kid that's just very highly talented. Conservatively, he's a top 150 kid nationally.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a big play guy. You're going to go after him because he can change your program. I mean, why would Penn State not go after him? It's not their fault what's going on in East Lansing. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, would you blame Nick Marsh's family if they didn't really want him there now?
Mm-hmm.
You know, or if Nick or anybody, I mean, it's just awkward. That's going to carry on for a long time. I mean, Penn State, they know what it's like to go through an awkward situation a little over a decade ago. This is different, but that's one of the oddest that I've ever seen. I mean, it's just odd. And it was something that was self-inflicted. Mm-hmm. This is a whole different deal than what Penn State went through. And to be honest with you, I think that Penn State is probably going to look at multiple kids from Michigan State, and so will other schools. So don't be surprised that the Spartans recruiting class is dwindling very soon.
Yeah, decimated. And unfortunately, one person's loss is another person's gain. You got to imagine that Nick Marsh is going to consider, I would say, Penn State, Pitt, and Kansas all over again, just because they were in the final leg of the race for Marsh when it ultimately came down to and it seemed like everything was projecting towards Penn State. I'm not going to disrespect Kansas and Pitt and their recruiting pitch towards him, but it was all Penn State until Michigan State kind of came in with that last second visit right before and basically flipped his mind to commit to the Spartans. So Penn State was right down there at the finish. I imagine that they're going to have an easier time being able to re-recruit him over some other schools if he decides to go away from the hometown school. But that would definitely be, I think Penn State, if we're to sit here again today and reassess where Penn State is for the class of 2024, they're in a good spot, you know, being top 10, just on the outside of the top 10, solidified in the top 15. I like this class. You have a quarterback, you have wide receivers, you have multiple talented 4-star wide receivers. You got the offensive lineman to go along with it. So that makes the Jaylen Matthews decommitment hurt a little bit less because the year before you have all the resources there. DM Barnes did good enough with the defensive line. I'd still like to see them get Jaylen Harvey and preferably Brian Robinson here. But I like the class of 2024 for Penn State a lot. I think they can be an iconic class.
If they can add one or more pieces at those key spots, I would feel better too. We're on par.
Yeah.
Can you add somebody we're not talking about? Let's be honest. Franklin's a shrewd guy. If there's somebody that he evaluates and or somebody on his staff and they want to go after him, committed or else, whatever, they could add somebody that you and I just flat don't know about.
Yeah.
That is how recruiting works. And it's the beginning of the senior year for a lot of these kids. There's going to be somebody that was just off their offer list. It's going to play well. It's inevitable. So Penn State's class will change, and it'll probably change for the better. They have a very good chance to end up in the final top 10 rankings.
Let's wrap it all up here, Brian, with the class of 2025. And I know you've already said this. You've said it before the show. You've said it during the show. 2025 is still far out. So Penn State fans shouldn't get too upset given that Jaylen Matthews decommitted. I mean, yes, you want Penn State to keep its high-profile recruits. You want them to have the best class that is possible. And Penn State has always been notorious for starting out any class cycle with one of the better ones inside the top 10 because they get recruits to commit early. You still have Amari Gaines, you still have Keandre Barker, but 3 was better than 2, and the high-profile offensive tackle that you had to go along with it to be one of the face, at least one of the faces in the class of 2025. It definitely stings, but Keandre Barker is one of those long list of running back commits that is going to have a nice career at Penn State. Jay Sider's done an incredible job. The secondary still bolstered up. You said the cornerback is a very important position for Penn State if they're going to compete against the likes of Ohio State and Michigan. They need to have one of the top secondaries in the Big Ten, let alone the country as it is. So they've done a good job there, and especially with Barker, because as you said, Penn State they haven't had as much success recruiting the likes of Florida, Texas, and where's Barker right now? Down in Texas, and they were able to get his commitment. So that's saying something about Penn State. So the class of 2025 is a work in progress. The jury's still out on how good it can be. It's taken a hit. Jaylen Matthews to go along with this class, I would have sat back and said, yes, they are definitely going to be in the top 10. But I don't know. You're going to kind of have to change your projection back. It's just 2 kids committed in the class of 2025. They have Messiah Mickens in the class of 2026, and Mickens was just rated as a top 25 player in the nation. So Penn State still overall looks good for the distant future, but nothing set in stone here for the class of 2025. But Matthews decommitting, I'm going to have to scale it back a little bit and say, oh yeah, Penn State has they are definitely going to be in the top 10 to now of it could be anywhere all over the map as far as are they in the top 25, the top 15. They could be in the top 10, but it's going to take a lot more work now. It's
early. There's a lot of kids Penn State's going to get, and they've already got a great running back commitment, et cetera. That it'll kind of build on itself. But I think the rest of the season's a big part of 25. Mm-hmm. Drew Aller is a very rare player in terms of his upside, but nobody has any idea how good he is until he plays Penn State, or plays Ohio State, Michigan. Mm-hmm. Look, those are the barometers. He knows it too. Hell, he grew up right in the shadow of Ohio State. So he understands that. When they play those games, if he plays well, and this has zero to do with Franklin, it's going to help the program. If he plays bad, it's going to hurt. He's very, very important for Penn State to develop and see him get better.
That is Brian Smith on the other side of the Locked On Podcast Network, recruiting expert, also the host of Locked On Seminoles. Check out that show if you want to keep up with the Noles. Subscribe to Locked On Nittany Lions. Become an everydayer. Follow along wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment. Let us know what you think about the class of 2024, 2025, what players Penn State should get. We'll have more Penn State football content on the way on the show here. Brian, thanks so much for stopping back on the show, and can't wait to have you on again when more recruiting news does pop up here in the not too distant future.
Thank you very much. I look forward to it.